All right. So, simple API development with Laravel. Let's get right into it. Most of you probably don't know who I am, so I'm just going to talk about myself for a little bit here. I'm a senior application developer at Visual Chefs, and we are based in Richmond, Virginia, which is about 2 hours south of here. And I live there with my beautiful wife and my little dude there who's going to, I can't believe he's going to be 1 a week from tomorrow. And then our lazy dog. For me, things I kind of like geek out about is I like playing bass and guitar, and I don't look quite as cool as that when I'm rocking out, but that's all right. And I do have kind of a sick obsession with 90s alternative rock. Definitely a gamer, and kind of like the music. I really prefer it from 1990 to 1996. And then pretty much watch anything with zombies in it. So I think that really kind of rounds out my nerd credentials in one slide. Where you can find me, blog, Twitter, GitHub. And so why am I here today? The first thing is because I'm in love with Laravel, and really, it kind of all started with V2 when Taylor first posted the docs for that, and I was on Thanksgiving break with my family and just sat there for a couple hours reading the docs on an iPad. I'm here to hang out with all of you, the Laravel community, which in many ways, especially from the show of hands yesterday, is really the I used to be with CodeIgniter, met Laravel at the funeral community. We're just kidding. I'll let Phil and Sean have that one out. And then, I'm here to talk to you about building REST APIs with Laravel. So what we're going to be doing today is really kind of three different areas. So we're going to talk about foundation and best practices of building an API. And we're going to talk about adding authentication. And then we're going to talk about rate limiting. And why do this with Laravel other than the fact that we are at a Laravel conference? Something I like to think, I consider Laravel to kind of be the perfect merger of simplicity and power, which, on the surface, it's really expressive. It's really easy to get started with. And as soon as you kind of look under the hood, it's just kind of mind-blowing what you find. So it's just really, there was talk yesterday of people saying, the framework really grows with you, and I find that to be really true. REST is a big part of the foundation of Laravel. As soon as you're writing routes, you're basically, starting to implement RESTful services. And then filters and events really try to, keeps things really clean and organized, which is something that, I haven't really seen in a lot of other frameworks at this point. But also, Laravel is possibly the greatest export from Arkansas since Walmart. Well, I should say except for my wife, who is from there, and my dog, and my college degree. But no, I'm not from there. I only lived there during college. Anywho, let's talk about REST. What is it? I'm pretty sure we all have a general idea, but I like putting big, ridiculous definitions into presentations. So I'm going to actually read this off. And this is pulled from Wikipedia. Representational state transfer, or REST, is a style of software architecture for distributed systems such as the World Wide Web. REST has emerged as a predominant web service design model. The REST architectural style was developed in parallel with HTTP 1.1 based on the existing design of HTTP 1.0. REST exemplifies how the web's architecture emerged by you know what? Just screw it, I don't know. It's a better definition, which is also pulled from Wikipedia. A RESTful web service, also called a RESTful web API, is a service implemented using HTTP and the principles of REST. And for the most part, it's a collection of resources. So I think that's a little bit more fitting. What it really kind of boils down to, though, is that REST uses standard HTTP methods to perform specific actions. So if we were going to kind of map this to, like, the notion of CRUD, I mean, we would, for the most part, as a general rule of thumb, we're going to see, how these different HTTP methods kind of map to that. And also to note is that it's much, much cooler than that other web services protocol that we all just absolutely hate. Although I guess I should ask, has anybody actually liked interacting with SOAP? Yeah, that's what I thought. So today we're going to build a sample REST API, and it's just going to be, really just keep it very simple, but we're going to kind of follow the boring to-do list model, and just do it as an API. But a few things to note before we really get into it is that, I'm going to assume you have a basic knowledge of Laravel. I'm not going to talk about like, setting up models and setting up database migrations and things like that. But to kind of jump off that, all the code is already available on GitHub. So you can just kind of see it all there. We are trying to keep things very, very simple with this. So we're not going to talk about content negotiation or e-tags, or if anybody knows how that is actually pronounced. I would love to know, because I always kind of read it as Hadios, which sounds like a cereal of some kind, But we're not going to talk about those type of things. We're just going to stick to the basics. Also, these are, kind of my solutions to these problems. It's just, I'm not trying to sound greedy about that, because it's not exclusively, but it's just kind of, this is how I went about solving these problems. And they're not applicable to every developer or every project that you're going to work on. And it should also be noted that there is no like one right way to build an API. But there are a lot of wrong ways. And see, REST was a doctoral dissertation, so it's like there are certain, established guidelines and principles that you really should follow when you're building a REST API. And I kind of see it as kind of like, a carton of milk. Like the basic principles, like don't drink out of the carton and keep it refrigerated. And if they're not, but these aren't really enforced. So, you can completely disregard them and you still technically have a working API at the end. Much in the way that ignoring the last principles is that's technically still milk. But I don't want to have anything to do with that. So what this means is that there's a lot of bad APIs out there. And just a few examples of some of the stuff that I've seen, and unfortunately this has been rather recently. This was considered a valid 404 response. So you can see we have a 200 OK and not found as the sole signifier of what happened. This is one of my favorites. This was a valid JSON response. And the docs for this API actually did say, the first item over there is the ID. The second item is the name of the task. And then is it completed and the dates. And so you end up just pipe separating a bunch of stuff. And that's not JSON. And it's also not text/HTML. And this was considered a valid JSON response too. So these guys actually had the option to return all of their JSON in base 64 encoded, because that's what we all want, right? And I know, yeah, it's stupid. What's the deal with that? Okay, I'm glad that was actually well received. People got that. So that brings us to part one, foundations and best practices. And before we even get started on that, I'm going to say, you're going to want to find a good testing tool when you're starting to build a REST API, because if you try to do this in the browser, you're going to get frustrated very quickly, especially when you get to the point where you're trying to do anything other than a GET request. Yeah. So a couple of things I like using is there's this really cool Chrome extension called Postman. And it's a little weird because it is still using the browser to do this. So it's like, once you will get logged into sites if you're hitting their APIs and stuff like that. It's a little weird. But it's pretty nice, and you can like store collections of saved requests and things like that. Little app in the Mac App Store called Rested, which is pretty nice, and same idea. And then if I'm doing it on the command line, I actually like using this tool called HTTPy, which is basically just a wrapper for curl. But it gives you some nice shortcuts to doing things. You can see it like nicely formats out, your responses and puts all the headers in there and stuff like that. So that's pretty cool. So now that we know we're gonna, be testing it with, we're gonna look at the session driver. So by default, every API request is gonna spawn a new session, because Laravel uses a cookie to kind of, when you're in your browser, to kind of keep track of you, regardless of what, data or what session storage engine you're using. But since we're not really passing cookies back and forth, you're going to end up with a lot of junk data, depending on, what storage engine you're using. And so, if you're using the file storage, that's what 100 API requests over the span of about a minute when I was testing this. And so we just don't want to deal with that. And you're also going to get a bunch of unnecessary cookies that get generated. Not a bunch, but it's like you don't really need them for anything. And so that's kind of what you would get back. And again, it's not really hurting anything. There's maybe a tiny performance hit, but your user just doesn't really need it. So the solution, and this is all kind of based around Laravel 4, is Taylor added this array driver for session and cache. And so all you have to do is that's it. Just set that in your app config session file. And what's cool about it is that you can still use session features. It's just there's not going to be persistent and you're not going to have cookies. So you can still use all your session put get just to kind of carry things, I guess, around classes without setting global variables if you want to do that. So that was a nice addition to Laravel 4, because when I first started doing this and it was in 3, like you pretty much just had to disable the session driver altogether. So the next piece is we want to set up our error handling. And for this API, we're really just going to worry about JSON responses. So we want our errors to also return JSON. So what you can see here is, like, this is just, this probably could be done a whole lot better, but I think it at least gets the point across. Is like, we've set up a global error handler for just the Symfony HTTP exception, and it'll pass a code to that. And so what we're doing is we're just kind of going through this and setting some default messages, and in like the 401 case, a header that's going to get returned with the error. And then at the bottom, it's like if the exception had a message passed to it, we'll send that. Otherwise, we'll just send the default message based on the error code. And then a couple others that I set up just specific to this, to my code in this one here is just I have a error message exception, which you can pass like a validation object to, and then pull messages out of it that way. And then a couple things I'm using in the model here is the not found exception and a permission exception. So nothing big. And so this is really kind of where we start getting into some of like the theory behind it, I guess. But we want to make sure we're building like RESTful URIs and then having the corresponding routes that go with them. And so, your URIs are really going to kind of follow this type of structure. There's going to be a type or a collection, and then followed by an identifier. And then the next level down is another collection or type, and then another identifier. So in our case, we're doing to-do lists. We would have lists and tasks that are kind of associated with those. So that's really, the base structure of everything you're going to see here. And then remembering that, the HTTP method is really, mapped to the URI to perform an action. So your URL shouldn't be having like, update or create or any of that stuff in them, at least as far as the API is concerned. So example in this case, if we do a GET request to lists, we're going to get all of our lists back. List 1, list with an ID of 1. This is, you can see how this is going. So it's, get all tasks for list 1, get a specific task, create a new list, update a list, delete a list, and then the same thing with tasks, really. So while we're on the topic of URIs, I'm going to say that it is a very, very good idea to version your URIs. So in this case, I'm actually doing everything with a v1 prefix in front of all these routes. And it's actually really easy to do in Laravel 4 because Taylor added this prefix to like a route group. So I don't have to put v1 into each of my routes as I specify them. So that's made it a lot easier. And then of course, you can see we have some filters that are running before these groups of routes that we'll talk about later. The good thing about versioning, though, is that we can completely re-architect our API later without really breaking anything. And we don't want to catch a beat down from our users for breaking their apps. Next part, so we want to send good responses, and that includes headers. And I already showed some examples of ones that did not include, well, they didn't include good responses or headers. But the response code is very important because it really tells you what actually happened during the request. And the old way that we probably all done this is just kind of passing something back with our response is just success false. And I think we kind of did that a lot with Ajax interactions and things like that. But common response codes that at least I'm using in this API, which probably will be used in all of them, but you're really just kind of paraphrasing. 200 is success. 201 is if you created something. 204 means that it was successful, but we're not returning any content. 400 is request not fulfilled, which in this case is really what I'm using if you had a validation error. 401 is if you're not authenticated. 403 is a refusal to respond by the server, which really I'm kind of doing that for, it's used a lot of times if you require authentication and the authentication didn't work or the credentials were wrong. Or also in this case is like if I create a list and someone else tries to access one of my lists, it's going to respond with a 403 so they don't have permission to see it. 404 and 500 is just kind of really any other error. So an example use case of why it might be important, and this is not a very good use case, but we make a curl request to an API, we get some info with the HTTP code. If the code's not 200, we're going to handle the error properly, and then if the code is a 404, we may do some external logging or notify a developer or something like that. So just really basic example of how the error code or the status codes can really be used to do some different things. So in our case, let's look at how our API actually responds to our URIs. And I'm just going to start with kind of going at the specific list level and then going down into the tasks. So we have v1 lists 1, so we're getting a specific list. And this is just really about as basic as it gets. We've got a 200 OK, application JSON content type, and then just a very basic JSON object. And the route that kind of goes behind that, and this is kind of how I'll just show you a response and then show you the route that goes with it. So this is just kind of the route that I have set up for that. And really there's two things I just kind of want to point out in this, just specific to this talk. So you're going to see this find by owner and ID method, and then something that I think Jeffrey pointed out in his talk yesterday about you could just return an object and it would generate the JSON for you out of a route. But I'm actually doing toArray, and I'll show you why. The first thing, the find by owner and ID. What I found doing this, and what we probably do a lot of times, is every route we were doing, we kind of make you pass an ID for a list, so you go and you find the list. And if you don't find it, you throw a 404, and then you have to check the user and see if that list belongs to that user, and if it doesn't, then you're going to throw another error. And so I just kind of compressed it into just an extra method on my task list model. And we have those global, you'll notice in the routes, I'm not actually catching any of these exceptions because we did set up that global error handler for those that would return a specific response. And then the toArray, the reason I had to do this, and I don't know if it's still true right now, but in Laravel 3, when you had custom getters and setters on your models and you did toArray or toJSON, it would actually use your custom getters and setters on your model to generate those. It doesn't really do that anymore. Like I said, at least right now it doesn't. So what I did is I just, on that model, just kind of overloaded the toArray method so that I can actually strong type some data. And the real necessity for this came on post requests, when it would just return the raw object instead of pulling it from a database. So in your JSON, it was actually JSON encoding a date time object, which didn't really make a lot of sense. So just something to consider in that case. So now we get the tasks for our first list. We don't have any yet. So just an empty array, nothing big. We don't need to really handle that any special way. And you can see that it's pretty straightforward. Again, we're just getting the list, the tasks, and turning those into an array. So we want to create a task. We just make a post request to list1 tasks. And, fine. All right. So things to do at Laracon, I made a CodeIgniter joke during my presentation. Cool. So we did that. And we're going to get a 201 created response back. The object itself, I've seen this kind of done two ways. I like returning the whole object just so you can kind of, you have all that information right there, for you as soon as the request is finished. But I've also seen just returning the ID, which I think either way is fine. It's really up to you. And again, that's kind of the route there. So getting the list, checking that the currently auth user belongs to, creating a new task. And I'll note also, if you look at the code, I'm whitelisting the properties. Don't do that if you're not whitelisting the properties, because you will get hacked. I have a validate method on my task, which will throw a different type of exception that gets caught globally. And then we're just assigning this list to the current, assigning list to the user. If we can't save it, we're just going to throw a 500 error in this case, and then we're just going to return the task to array with a 201 created. So now when we get the tasks for list 1, we're going to see we have an array of objects. And it's sad that I'm sure we've probably all seen this too, where like sometimes either everything comes back in array or nothing does. It gets pretty frustrating pretty quick, so just wanted to point that out. But again, it's really the same object in the end. So now if we get that specific task, it's almost the exact same response except for no array this time. We just got one single object. And that one really, again, just pretty basic route. So I've already made a code igniter joke during my presentation, so we can complete this one. So we're just going to pass a completed equals true, and I actually, since it's going to pass everything as a string, I actually have in the task model that really it'll take yes, y, 1, true, any of that type of stuff, and just mark it as true in the in the actual database or whatever. And so we get a 200 OK. We updated successfully. Send it back, and you can see completed is now equals true, and the updated at timestamp has been updated. And again, just looking at the route, just for fun, we're just going to kind of fill the task model, validate it, save it, and then return it back. And since we don't need that anymore, since it's been completed, we could just delete it. And since we don't really need to send any information back, all we need to do is say that this was a successful request. So 204, don't expect any content, and then we should be good enough with that. So nothing crazy. I will note, though, like I have a response make down here instead of a response JSON. Currently, right now, I think the way that Symfony's response class that Laravel kind of extends, it will automatically throw a content type of text HTML on it if you don't specify one, unless it's a response JSON. Doesn't really matter, but it's just something you might see if you're really picky about it. And then what about the errors that we've thrown? If I try to get a URI that doesn't exist, then it's going to be caught by our 404 handler, and we're just going to get requested resource was not found, or we can customize a message however we want to do it. And then if we have a validation error, we'll get a 400 bad request. And in this case, I'm just returning the first error that occurred. So we didn't pass a description to our task, and so it's required. So to sum up that kind of first part, we don't want to test in the browser. We want to use the array session driver. We want to handle our errors properly. We want to pay attention and spend time doing some good URI design. And then we want to send good responses. So the next piece I want to talk about is authentication. And really, this serves two primary purposes, which come as a surprise to no one, but it's to identify the user, and it's to really keep that user from causing trouble by looking, at other people's content and things like that. When it comes to API authentication, I think it's really important that we don't try to really reinvent the wheel. I think it's good to see what other very well-designed APIs currently do. In the case of this one, my example, I actually spent a lot of time looking at Campaign Monitor's API, which is probably one of the most well-documented APIs that you will ever come across. And so I kind of copied some of their ways of doing authentication and just some other stuff too. But if you look around, you're probably going to see some of these, these three options really for authenticating your API. If you look at some of these older ones, you're going to see them passing an API via query string, which is it's not RESTful and it's not necessarily secure. So just don't even do it. But you will probably see it. HTTP authentication, where you're kind of passing, either a secret API key or user password for credentials. And then OAuth for a lot of the newer stuff, which is really just kind of, well, it's not really simple at this stage. And so since we're talking about simple API development, we're just going to go with option number 2. And specifically in this case, we're going to pass an API key as a username over HTTP basic auth, and then the password can really just be anything. And again, I'm just kind of copying Campaign Monitor's example on this one. You could just as easily say, we could just use a username and a password, or an email address and a password for that. But I did want to demonstrate, in this case, how we can generate API keys for our users. And so again, at the most simple form of this, in my user model, we have a static method called create API key, and right now it's just returning a random 32 character string, which I think just recently Taylor actually made it so that it's now using the OpenSSL random bytes to make it a lot more truly random than it used to be. And so we're really just but we can swap this out if you had a better way to do it or whatever. And then at first when I had done this, I was actually overloading the user save method and kind of checking, like, if this doesn't exist yet, then let's go ahead and generate the API key, which is still probably a better way to organize it. But then I saw in one of the recent betas that this kind of syntax at the bottom had been added to almost make it kind of work with like event dispatchers. So we can now say, our user model creating, and it will run this closure when the model is actually created. So we can just generate an API key right there, and that can just kind of be organized with all of our event listeners. And so now we just create a simple filter to authenticate, and it's really, really basic. We're going to run this before every request, and all we're doing is we're getting the user, which is pretty smart because there's a couple different ways to get that depending on your server. And so Symfony is smart enough to kind of get that. And so if we don't have it, then we're going to throw a 401 with that message. And then we're going to try to find the user where they have the API key equal to whatever they passed in the authentication, and just get the first one. And so if we don't find a user with that, then we're just going to abort with a 401 as well. Otherwise, we'll log them in. And so if you're going to do this in PHP with curl, well, I've seen this before, I figured just throw it in there anyways. So, curl opt user password, that's our API key, and then I think a lot of the older like Rails APIs kind of used X as just like a generic password when they weren't requiring one. So just kind of went with that. If you're using Postman, which we talked about earlier, there's a wonderful little tab for basic auth, and you just plug those in and hit refresh, and it'll hold on to those for you. Same thing with rested, one of the other things we talked about. And then HTTPy, which is, just plug in the auth variable. And so if we fail authentication, we're going to get a 401 unauthorized. We're going to have our www authenticate, basic realm, REST API, application JSON, and our error. And if we pass, our request succeeds, so we're all good to go, and we can move on to the next thing. Yes. So rate limits. Rate limits are the second line of defense against abuse of our API, whereas authentication is kind of the first. One of the tricky things is like we kind of have to figure out on a per project basis like how and what we're going to rate limit. So you can do it kind of overall per user. You can throw IP address into the mix. You can have a different rate limit for every different method if you want to do that, which like Twitter does on some of their stuff. So you just really need to figure out. But in our case, we're just going to keep it easy. Just go with an overall hourly limit per user. And so what we want to do for this is I found the easiest way is to just kind of pick a key value storage engine, preferably something that's in memory, which really your options are probably going to come down to this, APC, Memcache, or Redis, all of which are fantastic. They're all very lightweight, very, very fast. But the real magic that kind of comes into play here is that we can automatically expire keys at specified intervals with these types of technology. So we're just going to use APC for this since most of the time you're going to want to run it anyways because you'll get some performance boost out of it. But why not use Laravel's cache? We could use any driver then if we wanted to. And again, at the time of writing this, there's no way really with the cache system to update a value without changing the time to live on it. Is that right, Taylor? Okay. Yeah. Okay. And so again, a simple filter to do this. So with API or with APC, first thing we want to do is we want to build a key. So we're just going to call it API : whatever our user's API key was, since at this point when this runs, they've already been logged in. APC add will only add this key if it doesn't already exist. So we can set it to 0 and then tell it to expire in an hour. We're going to increment the count by 1. And then we have in a config file somewhere else, we have, I think I put like 100 requests per hour or something. So then it's just simple comparison. If count's bigger than the number of requests per hour, then we're going to tell them, sorry. But the cool thing about that is because we didn't change the time to live, once the next hour hits, they start back to 0. And so we don't have to do any kind of cleanup on that. So some closing thoughts. I hope I was able to demonstrate that APIs can be pretty simple. They don't need to be complicated. We really other than just the basic stuff. It was really 2 filters that added some pretty cool features. I'm gonna plead that please stick to RESTful principles. Follow the URI patterns, follow the response guidelines and things like that. And then these are really applicable to any project you work on. Just utilize your resources. I've already talked a couple times about copying from well-designed APIs. Especially if they're documented very well, it should be pretty easy to do. Have other developers use it. Put it into someone else's hands because they're going to tell you right away if it's a pain to work with or if something's just not working. And then, like I said, REST. The principles of REST. It was a doctoral dissertation, so unless you're really interested about becoming very intimate with that, there's a ton of people out here that are smarter than even everyone in this room. But it's like just ask on the internet, and people are going to answer. Because I just don't think we can deal with any more of the nasty milk APIs. We just don't want it. So that's it for me.
All right. Anybody have a question?
Questions?
Got a couple minutes.
Hey, just had a real quick question. When you were talking about validation, you were throwing a 400, I believe, validation fail. I've typically always thrown 422s, which was, I'm looking this up right now, unprocessable entity.
Okay.
What's your thoughts on 400 versus 422, or is there a reason you don't use 422s?
So preference of 400 error code versus 422.
Honest tabs versus spaces. Right? No. Honestly, it was just from kind of looking around at what others did, and I looked at a number of Google APIs, and again, like I said, I can't talk enough about like whether or not you love Campaign Monitor or not. It's like their API docs are just so perfect. And they detail like what all of their kind of error codes are and what they mean and things like that. But kind of the general rule that I saw was 400 tended to be used in most places, and it kind of worked that way with 403 as well. Like a lot of them were using that to kind of say either rate limit had exceeded or you weren't allowed to do something. But there's a website, http status.es, and it's just a huge, pretty nicely designed list of like all these different status codes, and just like a very quick explanation of what each one means. And so that's kind of a nice reference to look at for that type of stuff. And they even have some of the proprietary ones, like Twitter, I guess, has some like custom status codes that they use for things, and they'll throw it in there just so you can reference it.
API versioning. An opinion.
So header or content type, possibly. It just seems kind of overcomplicated to me. I think as a developer, it's like if I don't have to check in the headers of a request every time, then I'd prefer it. I guess there's nothing really wrong with it, but unless you're writing kind of a wrapper for your API, for other people to use, like where you can kind of automate and force that to happen. I think it's, I was talking to Chris Fidel earlier. He wrote some really great stuff on e-tags, and it was kind of that, with e-tags, it's like you're kind of hoping that the user actually sends those along to make them effective. So it just, to me, it seems kind of the same principle there.
XML responses. That answers itself, I guess. I don't know.
My Andy Richter. Yeah. I mean, like I said, for this purpose, we just did it with JSON. I know, I guess it's like, Rails used to be like XML exclusive, and then they switched to kind of JSON exclusive, I guess, out of the box. And it really depends on, I guess, who your user base is. I think I don't know. I don't know if anybody actually likes parsing XML. But I've seen, I guess, the trend lately, and unless anyone's seen different, I mean, it's really seems like a lot of these are kind of just going just JSON. But with the content negotiation stuff, I think the standard practice is you would either send like a an HTTP accept, or just an accept header, and tell it like either application JSON or text XML, and it would kind of send the response back based on what you passed, or just setting up the routes to be .json or .xml or whatever.
All right, you're done.
I'm done. Cool. Thank you.